He had been driving the same route along Liberation Road in Accra for 6 years when he first saw her. It was 7:04 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, dry season, and the harmattan had already pressed the temperature to 33 degrees before most of the city had finished its first cup of tea. She was on the verge at the left side of the road, moving in the same direction as the car. She wore a faded blue kaba. She carried a brown leather satchel across one shoulder. She walked at the pace of someone who knew exactly how far they had to go and had already accepted every step of it. Kolade noticed her because of her shoes. Flat-heeled, slightly formal, the kind a woman wears to church on Sunday, and completely wrong for 4.7 kilometers of dry season asphalt at 7:15 in the morning. He noted her and drove on. The next morning she was there again, and the morning after that. He did not yet know what she was walking toward, but what was inside the satchel on her shoulder had been waiting 31 years for someone in that car to find it. Her name was Adaeze Okafor. She was 71 years old, and she weighed 49 kilograms. 8 kilograms less than she had weighed 3 years earlier, when there had been a gas cooker that worked, and food budgeted into the week without counting what was left. She lived in a single room in a compound house off Abasiokai Road, a room that cost 380 cedis per month, which she covered by doing alterations for her neighbors at 15 cedis per piece, and by selling small sachets of ground pepper and dawa from a table she set up outside her door on Friday and Saturday. Mornings. Most weeks, this was enough to eat. Not every week. The blue kaba she wore to walk to the Labor Commission was the only dress she had that still held its shape properly. She had sewn it herself in 2019 from indigo cotton found on sale at a stall near Makola Market. 2 meters at 18 cedis per meter, which she had counted out in the exact bills before she touched the bolt. She washed it every Sunday by hand in a plastic basin, wrung it out carefully with both hands, and hung it on the line inside the compound, where it dried overnight in the dry harmattan air. It was clean. It had never not been clean. That was a decision she had made long before she ever had reason to defend it to anyone. The satchel on her shoulder was brown leather, bought from a trader at Makola Market in 1998 for 15,000 old cedis. The handle had been repaired twice, once with a strip of bicycle inner tube, once with brown cord pulled tight and sealed with the tip of a lighter. Inside the satchel she carried 3 things every morning, without variation: a folder of documents held together with a rubber band that had cracked and been knotted back into service, a plastic bottle of water refilled at the compound tap before she left, and a small dented tin with a red and silver pattern around the edge. She always placed the tin at the top of the satchel before she buckled it shut. It had been the first thing she packed every morning for 7 months. The documents in the folder were what she walked for: 31 years of employment, payslips going back to 1987, a service record stamped by 4 different supervisors, a letter from the original general manager of Bright Star Garments dated September 1993, and a pension claim form that had been rejected 3 separate times by the Labor Commission on the grounds of insufficient supporting documentation. She had been told each time what was missing. She had gone and obtained it each time and returned with it and submitted it again. The 4th rejection had arrived by post 8 weeks earlier. It cited a reason different from the previous 3. Adaeze had worked at Bright Star Garments in the industrial area of Accra from 1984 to 2015, 31 years. She had started at 23 as a junior seamstress and left at 54 as the head of the finishing department, responsible for 19 workers and the final quality check on every garment leaving the factory floor. She knew how to sew a buttonhole that would last 20 years. She could look at a seam from 6 feet away and tell whether the tension was off by 0.5 millimeter. She could grade a pattern by hand without a ruler, matching each piece to the next the way a person matches a song they have heard since childhood. Not by counting, but by feel. That had become precision. These things lived in her fingers the way language lives in the mouth. Not learned anymore. Just present. When Bright Star Garments was acquired by Owusu Botang Holdings in 2016, all workers over 60 were invited to what was described as a transition briefing. Blessing Asante, the transition HR manager sent by the new ownership, stood at the front of the factory canteen and explained that workers could choose to continue under revised contracts or take a dignified early exit. The dignified early exit came with a form. The woman sitting beside Adaeze that day was Abina, who could read English faster, and she had looked down at the form briefly and whispered that it was just an acknowledgement form. It was not an acknowledgement form. It was a full waiver of pension rights, 31 years of contributions, employer and employee side, with accumulated statutory interest valued at the time at 847,000 cetus. Addis had signed it because Abina said it was fine and because she was 62 years old and had not slept the night before, and the room was warm and the pen was already in her hand. She did not discover what she had signed for 11 months. By then, Blessing Asante had left for a position in Kumasi. The form had been witnessed and filed and closed. The pension office said the waiver was legally valid. There was nothing to do. That had been 9 years ago. She had been walking to the Labor Commission for 7 months now, every Tuesday and Thursday without exception. Sometimes Monday as well. She left her compound at 6:47 a.m. to reach the building by 8:15 and be in the queue before the doors opened. She did not tell the other compound residents what she was doing. She folded her documents back into their folder every morning with the same movement her mother had taught her for folding cloth. Smooth from the center outward, no crumpling, no force, as though whatever was on the paper deserved to be treated carefully regardless of what it said. The National Labor Commission occupied the 5th floor of a building on Liberia Road that shared its ground floor entrance with a mobile money agent and a photocopy shop that smelled of warm toner and old paper. The elevator worked on 3 days out of 5. On the other days, a daisy climbed the stairs. The 5th floor had a waiting area with blue plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows of 6, a reception desk made of dark laminate, and a counter behind which 3 clerks worked in separate cubicles divided by frosted glass panels. The clerk assigned to pension dispute cases in cubicle 7 billion was a man named Asidou Darko. He was 44 years old, medium build, and wore a blue polyester short-sleeve shirt to work every day. His name tag read, Asidou Darko, Senior Pension Claims Adjudicator. He had held this position for 6 years. He had not written the rules, he applied. He had been given the rules and he applied them. That was his understanding of his job. On Adaise's first visit, he had looked at her dress before he looked at her documents. On every subsequent visit, he looked at the documents, then at his screen, and did not look at her face. The procedure, he explained, was consistent. A rejection letter listed the required documentation. When submitted, a review was initiated with a 30-business-day window. At the end of the window, a determination was issued. If negative, a further appeal could be filed within 21 days, requiring a new form, a 200 CD fee, and documentation different from what had already been submitted. Adaise had filed 4 claims and was now on her first formal appeal. The appeal had been pending 47 business days. She visited Tuesdays and Thursdays to check the status. It had not changed in 11 weeks. The security guard at the building's entrance was a young man named Felix, who wore his uniform cap slightly off-center and had started recognizing her sometime in the 3rd month, and now nodded her through. Without stopping her, near the entrance, a woman in her early 60s had a table where she sold waki from a large pot she carried to that spot every morning before 7:30. Her name was Pauline. She smelled of palm oil and something like wood smoke settled in the cloth. She had been at that table for 14 years and had a way of watching the building's foot traffic that carried no judgment, just the particular patience of a person who has stopped being surprised by anything she sees. She had started setting a small covered portion of waki aside on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When Adaise came back out, Pauline set it on the corner of the table without speaking. Adaise picked it up. Neither of them commented on the arrangement. By the 40th day of Koladi's awareness of her, she had shifted her route slightly to walk along a narrow strip of shade thrown by a row of neem trees planted along the median of the road. This told him the heat had become something she was managing rather than enduring. He watched her in the side mirror on the 43rd morning until the traffic near Kwame Nkrumah's circle thickened and he lost sight of her. He calculated the distance on the route from where she first appeared to the Commission building on Liberia Road, 4.7 kilometers one way. There and back, 9.4. 4 days a week was 37.6 kilometers. She was walking at minimum 38 kilometers per week in dry season Harmattan heat, in shoes meant for Sundays at 71 years old. The temperature that morning was 37 degrees at 7:11 a.m. The Meteorological Service had issued a heat advisory for the greater Accra region that would remain in effect for 5 consecutive days. That afternoon, he parked near the Commission building, walked to Pauline's table, bought a cup of tea from the woman beside her, and waited. Pauline looked at him. He said he had been driving past the old woman in the blue Kaaba every morning for weeks. He asked if she knew anything about her case. Pauline said, pension. Former worker from a garment factory. Coming for 7 months, every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes Monday, had been to see the man in cubicle 7,014 times. Each time something new was wrong with the paperwork. Each time she went away, found the missing thing, came back. New problem. Every time. She said this without drama, the way you describe a drain that blocks on a regular schedule. Then she paused and said, she walks here every time. In that dress, in this heat, and she always comes back out and starts the walk home. On a Thursday in the 6th week of his watching, Adaze arrived at the commission at 8:21 a.m. to find a notice taped to the inside of the glass door. The building would open at 10 a.m. due to a staff briefing. She looked at the notice for a moment. Then she sat down on the bottom step outside the entrance, because the chairs in the waiting area behind the locked door were inaccessible. The concrete of the step had already absorbed the morning heat. The shade from the door frame overhead would last until approximately 9:15, when the sun would move past it. She set the satchel across her knees and unclipped the top. The small tin with the red and silver patterns sat at the top. She moved it aside to reach the water bottle underneath. The tin was 9 centimeters by 6, the kind used for throat lozenges in an earlier era. Its red paint worn thin at the corners where it had been opened and closed thousands of times. On the bottom, scratched into the metal in letters approximately 2 millimeters high, were 2 initials, F.O. She drank from the water bottle. Then she held the tin in both hands the way she sometimes held it, flat on her palms, feeling the weight of it, which was not much. A woman named Felicia had worked at the bench beside hers at Bright Star Garments beginning in 1982. She had arrived one morning with this tin and set it between their 2 machines as though she had always had it there. She had left one morning in 1993 without explanation and had not come back the following day, or the day after, or the week after. She had left the tin on the bench before she went. She had touched Adaze's arm and asked her to keep it until she returned. Adaze had asked the factory supervisor, then the floor manager, then the gatekeeper who kept the logbook. Nobody knew the family. Felicia had never told her surname. The initials scratched into the bottom were the only name Adaze had ever had for her. She had carried the tin through every move since 1993, through 2 addresses, through the death of her husband in 2008, through the retirement, through the single room on Abasio Kai. She had decided at some point she could no longer pinpoint that as long as she was alive, she would keep carrying it. She opened the tin. Inside, 4 needles of different gauges laid in a strip of folded felt, a small spool of black thread wound tight, a thimble with a dent in the right side where it had been dropped once on a concrete floor, and a piece of folded white cloth tucked into the corner, approximately 10 centimeters square. She had never unfolded the cloth anywhere outside her own room. She closed the tin and held it flat in her palms again and looked at the road. Pauline came over from her table and set a container of wok on the step beside her without speaking. If the story is already settling somewhere in you the way I think it is, subscribe before we get to what Colade said to Emmanuel that evening. Because what Emmanuel finds inside that tin is something that changes the shape of everything that came before it. That evening, Colade told Emmanuel about the woman at the end of the drive when the car was parked in the compound of the house in Airport Residential, and Emmanuel had not yet moved to open his door. He told it the way he told things, briefly, without decoration. An old woman, Liberation Road, same route, every morning since February. Pension case. Former employee, Bright Star Garments, 7 months of walking, 47 business days with the appeal pending. He finished and waited. Emmanuel said he would see what could be done. The following morning, he asked his assistant to contact the commission about a pension dispute from a former Bright Star Garments employee. The assistant called and was told politely that individual case information could not be discussed with third parties without written consent from the claimant. Emmanuel's assistant relayed this. Emmanuel said fine and moved to his 8:45 meeting. 2 weeks passed. Colade saw her on the morning she appeared. He did not bring the subject up again. On a Wednesday, in the 3rd week, he did not see her at 7:19. He saw her at 7:44, moving more slowly than she usually moved, Her left hand pressed flat against the low concrete wall running along the roadside, steadying herself at intervals. She did not stop. She kept walking, but the hand stayed on the wall for every block between the junction and where the wall ended. That morning, Kolade parked the car in the compound and turned off the engine and waited for Emmanuel to finish his call. When the call ended, he said, "She is not going to be able to keep doing this." He said nothing else. He looked at the steering wheel. Emmanuel sat in the back seat for 11 seconds. Then he said, "Take me past that way tomorrow morning." They came along Liberation Road on a Tuesday at 7:06 a.m. At 7:09, Kolade said quietly, "There." Emmanuel looked to the left side of the road. An old woman in a faded blue kaba, a brown leather satchel on one shoulder, walking with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had learned over months how to conserve themselves across a distance. Her left hand was at her side this morning. She looked straight ahead. Emmanuel asked Kolade to pull alongside her slowly and lower the passenger window. She heard the car slow beside her. She turned her head and looked. A black Mercedes GLE, tinted windows, passenger window down. A man in the back seat looking out at her. She did not stop walking. He said through the window, "We can take you where you were going." She looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then she looked ahead and kept walking. He said, "My driver has seen you walking this route for weeks. We are going past the Labor Commission. It is not out of the way." She stopped. She turned and looked at the car. She looked at his face. Then she opened the door and got in. The air conditioning was cold after the morning heat outside. She placed both hands flat on her thighs and looked at the road ahead. They did not speak for the first 4 minutes. Then Emmanuel said, "You are going to the pension office." She said, "Labor Commission, pension dispute." He said, "Bright Star Garments?" She turned and looked at him. He said his name was Emmanuel Owusu Bowden. His company had acquired Bright Star 9 years ago. He had tried to reach her case through his assistant, but the commission would not discuss it without her written consent. 2 weeks ago, he had found the full transition file from 2016. The documentation for the waivers blessing Asante had collected did not meet the legal standard required for a valid pension forfeiture under current labor regulations. The waivers were challengeable. He had a lawyer already working on it for all 7 workers who had signed. She held the satchel across her lap with both hands and looked at the road ahead. The traffic near Kwame Nkrumah Circle had thickened, and Kolade drove without hurrying. The city moved past the windows. She said, "You people had us sign papers." He said, "I know." She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached into the satchel. She moved the documents aside. She took out the small tin with the red and silver pattern and held it for a moment in both hands. Then she said, "This tin, I have been carrying it for 31 years. It belonged to a woman who worked beside me at the factory starting from 1982. She left one morning in 1993 and never came back. Her name was Felicia. She never told me her surname. She asked me to keep this until she returned." She turned the tin over and held it out toward him. On the bottom, in letters 2 millimeters high, F.O. Emmanuel took the tin. He was very still. He turned it over once. He looked at the initials for a long time. Felicia Owusu, his mother, had worked at Bright Star Garments from 1982 until she was diagnosed with cervical cancer in early 1993. She had died in August of that year. Emmanuel had been 19 years old. He had never known the names of the women she worked beside, what her days looked like on that factory floor, what she had left behind, or who had carried it. There had been no one to ask. And then 32 years passed, and the question had not gotten smaller. It had simply become one of those things a person carries without examining. He opened the tin. He looked at the needles in their strip of felt, the spool of black thread, the thimble with the dent on the right side. He looked at the folded piece of white cloth tucked into the corner. He did not unfold it. His hands stayed still. He said quietly, as though testing whether the words were true before saying them aloud, "She talked about a woman she worked with." A daze. A pause. She said she was the best finisher in the factory. Emmanuel called his lawyer from the car before they reached Liberia Road. He asked for the current status of the Bright Star pension challenge. She said her firm was preparing a formal submission, probable resolution within 30 to 60 days, once the commission initiated its review. He said he did not want to wait for the review window. He asked what was required to resolve the pension obligation directly, from his company's side, independent of the commission's process. She walked him through the figures. He said, "Proceed." They ended the call. Inside the commission building, the elevator was working. They rode up to the 5th floor. Adaze joined the queue at the counter. Emmanuel stood beside her. He had not announced himself at the reception desk. He waited the way she had waited for 14 visits, standing, holding nothing, looking straight ahead. When they reached cubicle 7B, Asidou Darko looked up. He recognized Adaze and reached for a standard form from the stack on his right. Then he registered the man standing beside her. He looked at him once. He looked at his computer screen. His hands stopped where they were. Emmanuel said, "My name is Emmanuel Owusu Boateng. My company, Owusu Boateng Holdings, acquired Bright Star Garments in 2016. This case has been in your office for 7 months with an appeal pending for 47 business days. I want to understand what is required to resolve it today." Asidou Darko's hand came back to the desk surface slowly. He said he would need to pull the full case record and consult with his supervisor before discussing resolution timelines. Emmanuel said, "Please do." Awusu Mensah came from the back office 6 minutes later. She brought a chair from the adjacent cubicle and offered tea. Emmanuel said no. He asked for the full list of outstanding documentation requirements for the appeal. She produced the file. He photographed every relevant page with his phone and sent the photographs to his lawyer from the building, standing at the counter with Adaze sitting in the chair beside him. The case was formally resolved 14 working days later. The settlement amount was 847,000 cedis in original pension value, plus 9 years of statutory interest calculated at the applicable rate totaling 1,340,000 cedis. It was deposited directly into an account opened in Adaze's name at a bank branch on Liberation Road, 2 blocks north of where Colady had first seen her walking in the Harmattan on a Tuesday morning in February. She signed the bank documents seated at a desk in a private office, not at a public counter. The desk had a chair with armrests. A glass of water was placed in front of her before the papers were set down. She drank from it before she read anything. The 3 other former Bright Star Garments workers still living in Accra, who had signed transition waivers, received their own settlements in the weeks that followed. Owusu Boateng Holdings funded all 4 in full. The total disbursed was 4.2 million cedis. The National Pensions Regulatory Authority subsequently issued a compliance advisory to employers regarding consent standards for pension waivers during company acquisitions. The advisory was developed partly from documentation in Adaze's case file. The first stakeholder consultation session was convened at the Labor Commission building on Liberia Road on a Tuesday morning, in the same room with the blue plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows of 6. Blessing Asante received formal notification that the waivers she had administered were under review. Her current employer received notification as well. Emmanuel asked Adaze if he could keep the tin. He asked it carefully. She looked at the tin in his hands, and then at his face, and then at the tin again. Then she said yes. He took it home that evening and set it on the shelf in his study beside the photograph of his mother taken in 1989, in which she is wearing a blue dress she has clearly sewn herself, with the seams running exactly straight, and she is laughing at someone outside the frame who is not visible in the picture. That night, he unfolded the piece of white cloth from inside the tin. It was a small square of high-quality cotton, precisely cut and hand-hemmed, with stitches so fine and even they looked as though a machine had placed them. In the center, embroidered in red thread with a needle no wider than a strand of hair, in letters half a centimeter high, "Fine hands." Emmanuel sat in that study for a long time. He had not been in there at night in years. He sat there until the city outside went quiet. The form Adaze signed in that canteen in 2016 was designed to function as an ending. 31 years of work, folded into a document she did not fully understand, witnessed, filed, and closed. A number set to 0 by a signature. That was meant to be the whole of it, but Adaze had been carrying things that had no line on any form. She had been carrying a tin for 31 years because a woman she barely knew had asked her to hold it until she came back, and Adaze had never once put it down. She had been carrying a skill, a particular rare understanding of how a seam is supposed to lie, how a buttonhole is supposed to hold, how a finished garment is supposed to feel when it is right, and that was not something that could be witnessed or filed away. She had been carrying her own case documents, refolded every morning with the same care her mother had taught her to bring to cloth. As though the paper deserved that treatment regardless of what it had done to her, none of these things had been on the form. None of them could be signed away. The world will look at a person on the side of a road and make a decision in 3 seconds. It sees the wrong shoes, the faded dress, the leather satchel repaired with cord. It makes an inventory of surfaces and calls it knowledge. It decides what that person is worth, what they carry, whether they are someone it needs to stop for. This decision is almost always wrong. What a person carries is not visible from a passing car. What 31 years of precision looks like is not visible in the way someone walks through the Harmattan heat. What a person has agreed to hold and kept holding long past any reasonable expectation is invisible to everyone except the person who has been holding it. But some mornings something shifts. A driver looks in the side mirror on a Tuesday in February, and something in him decides that this particular person is worth seeing. Not in a grand way, just worth the second look, then the third. Worth the conversation with the woman at the walk-eye table. Worth the quiet sentence at the end of a long day. She is not going to be able to keep doing this. 3 seconds of decision meeting 3 seconds of recognition. And between them, everything that follows, a day's Okafor no longer walks Liberation Road in the heat. She works 3 mornings a week teaching finishing techniques to apprentice seamstresses at a vocational training center in Akimoto. Buttonholes, seam tension, hand hemming, the final pass that determines whether a thing was made or merely assembled. She takes the trotro. She carries the same brown leather satchel with the cord repair on the handle, because it works, and she has never replaced what still works. On the first day of every month, she folds the bank statement that arrives from the account on Liberation Road and places it flat into her document folder, smooth from the center outward, no crumpling, no force, the way her mother taught her to fold cloth when she was small, as though everything you put your hands on deserves to be handled as though it matters. If someone placed a form in front of you on the worst day of your working life, and someone you trusted told you it was fine to sign, and you signed, and then you found out what you had given away, would you walk 9.4 kilometers a day every Tuesday and Thursday for 7 months to try to get it back? Or would you decide that the system was bigger than you, close the folder, and let it go? Leave your answer in the comments. I will read them. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.